Welcome to this public reading this evening by our guest artist, Kyle Tran Myhre. Thank you so much for being here, especially on this very dry, warm, comfortable evening here in Central Arkansas. And by that I mean cold, wet, and miserable, but it is going to be a lovely evening in here, and thank you so much for being here. Over the past, I forgot to mention, my name is Gretchen Renshaw James. I'm a professor in the music department here at Hendrix College, and over the last 3 years, I've had the great fortune to co-teach a class with my friend and colleague here, Dr. Delphia Shanks of the politics department. This class is called TEC, the Engaged Citizen, and I know that many of you in the room know basically everything about what it's about, but for those who might not, or who might need a refresher, this is a class that is required for all of our first-year students to take in their first semester, and the overarching idea of TEC is to help students bring two disciplines together to participate in meaningful engaged citizenship, which in a nutshell is what the liberal arts is trying to do as a whole. So this year we have 12 different sections, which means 12 different combinations of two different disciplines. So all of the classes are different, but yet the same in their goal of finding connections across these disciplines to do something that is greater than just the sum of their parts. So in our case, we combine music and politics. We use the musical Hamilton as a basis for understanding how the arts can play a major role in activism. Yeah, thank you for the jazz hands, I appreciate that. We even have some tools in our class that help our folks remember what are some of the main themes, and it's through a system of hashtags, which I've already seated the audience to share what is the most relevant hashtag involved in tonight's performance. What do you think, friends? No. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, Janley. That's right, hashtag arts as activism is one of the major themes of our class. And right now in the class, students are deep into working on our courses engaged learning experience, which are the policy battles, a takeoff on the Hamilton cabinet battles. And at this moment in the class, we could not be more fortunate than to have Kyle Tran Myhre here as our guest, because he embodies engaged citizenship, especially hashtag arts as activism. One of the two of us likes the hashtag thing a lot, and the other one does not. Take your guess as to who's who. Anyway, so Kyle is a poet, hip-hop artist, activist, and educator, and as you will hear tonight, he powerfully combines poetry and politics for a kind of activism that is deeply thought-provoking and that also brings people into conversations that we so desperately need to have.
I will not be using any of the pound sign in my talk. So I am also excited. I'm Delphia Shanks. I'm in the politics department. And I'm also super excited to have Kyle Tran Myhre here. I met Kyle and saw him first at the Decarcerate Conference in 2022. So a little bit of context. I work with organizations in Arkansas that work on prison abolition, and I volunteer with them. And it turns out, in fact, prison abolition is an idea that's a really big idea that's pretty scary and people don't necessarily understand, and they're like, no. And so it can feel really hopeless, because not only are you asking a system to change, you're asking people to change the logic that underlies the system in the first place, the idea of punishment as how we should be addressing accountability for things that we've done to harm the public good. So we're at this conference, and it's usually a series of people with these huge ideas, and they've got all of these successes, and it is both hope-inspiring, and then you go back to the grind. And but there was something different about Kyle's talk, right? He didn't just talk about his activism. He showed me hope in a way that other talks didn't. And in particular, this resonated because in the spring I taught an Inside Out class, which is a class that takes place inside of a correctional facility. So 12 inside students, 12 incarcerated students, and 12 Hendrix students. And one of the big pieces of feedback that came back was that the Hendrix students were so happy to be in a class where they didn't know what other people were about to say, right? Because by the time you get to be a junior or senior, you know a lot of the people in your major, and you know kind of, oh, this is what they're going to say. So you don't actually have to listen to them because you're already preparing your remarks in your head about how you're going to respond, right? So I saw Kyle, just to bring it full circle, at the Decarcerate Conference in 2022, and I remember his performance and I remember his talk, but what I really remember are two things in particular. The first is that he was on a panel, and one of the people on this panel was kind of out there and just had some really, in that group, inappropriate things to say, right? And so the panelists did what panelists do, which was ignore him. And everyone was just like, and not Kyle. Kyle was like, I want to come back to your point. And he addressed it. And he listened to the guy. He showed that he listened, and he responded thoughtfully and kindly and nicely and devastatingly to this, right? And I thought it was such a beautiful example of how to engage in a meaningful dialogue with people you don't agree with, that you have not encountered before, and you're doing it on the spot, in public, in front of people, right? And then the second thing is this zine on hope, which hope, it does not glimmer, it burns. And this is a zine that Kyle put together and that sits above is now taped above my desk in my office. So what I'm trying to say here is that what I've learned from Kyle, despite having done a lot of this work, and am reminded of, is that dialogue's a critical skill, but more importantly, it's a critical practice for our world today. And it's hard, and it's uncomfortable, and so being fluent in difficult conversations in all sides of an issue, and in gracefully confronting differences that are not just differences, but there are problematic differences, is something that really requires a clarity of values and purpose and thought. And it requires a generosity of spirit that I think he really does a good job of demonstrating. And if hope is a discipline, as Mariam Kaba writes, then learning how to dialogue is a way to exercise hope. And ultimately, this is why we asked Kyle to come to Hendrix. It's because being an engaged citizen is about creating hope, it's about exercising hope, and it's about maintaining hope in a world that is overwhelming. So he is an engaged citizen, and he is engaged meaningfully in the very real, very messy world that we're living in. And I still have a lot to learn from him, and I hope you all find something here for you as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a beautiful introduction, right? Like, usually people just read my bio, and it's kind of embarrassing. And, like, this was still very complimentary, but much less embarrassing because I didn't write it myself. And I really appreciate that. I really appreciate, not to go off on a sidetrack right away, but, like, I don't need to tell you this. I'm not the most famous person in the world. I have some moments in my career, like, if I'm going to, as long as I'm the headliner, I'm going to say, like, yeah, I'm a 2-time National Poetry Slam champion, and I performed at the United Nations, and I'm on, not performing live, but video at, like, Lollapalooza this year and Coachella, and, like, all this big stuff, which is cool. But the biggest moments from my practice as a working artist have been stuff like that, like, are not ever going to show up in your bio or, like, go viral on YouTube, but just, like, those moments where you are present in the space and trying to do something. Beyond just, look at me, look at me, look at me. And that's actually a good transition into what I wanted to start with tonight, which was that, I guess one thing you gotta know about me is that I'm not a motivational speaker. I think sometimes there is a stereotype about spoken word poets that it's gonna be like, all right, everyone, are you ready for some poetry? And, like, there's nothing wrong with being that guy, but I'm not that guy. And I generally do not get to show up to a college or a space and just be like, here are my 10 best poems so that you all like me and buy my book. That's just not my practice. And I think part of that is based in spoken word. We don't have time to do a whole, like, history lesson or, like, spoken word 101, but I think something really important is that, one, spoken word to me is not just poetry that you say out loud. There's an intentionality behind it, and that is poetry that is written to be performed. And there's a difference between recitation and performance, right? And so tonight I'm going to perform a little bit. But I think even beyond that distinction, an even deeper distinction is that poetry is not just, or spoken word is not just another kind of poetry or another approach to writing, but it's a cultural practice, right? Like, it's a cultural tradition that is connected to other cultural practices. I mean, every culture on earth has some version of the storyteller or the griot, right? The West African term griot, or the bard, or the person whose job it is to pass the values or the history of a people from generation to generation to generation. And I think that responsibility weighs very heavily. And I mean, a lot of us who do this work don't even know that history, but like, because I know the history, like, it's something I think about a lot. And I think, I'm gonna get into the poems in a second, but part of that tradition, that idea of spoken word as a cultural practice, something that has been really, really valuable to me and important to me is that spoken word poets that I look up to, that I respect, acknowledge context. That again, the work is not just to impress people or to entertain people, but it is to be a person in a space who can create space. If we are feeling grief, if we are feeling anger, to not just jump into the poems, but to create space for that. I think to make things that are invisible visible. I think that's a really important part of the work. And so, I'm going to, before I get into my poems, I want to bring other voices into the space. This is, in a universe of actions we can take in this historical moment, like a very, very small action, but I also think it matters. I'm actually gonna read two poems. As it turns out, it's a Palestinian poet and a Jewish American poet. I didn't pick them because of the identity thing, but just because they were the poems that I think really speak to this moment. And I think the least we can do in this historical moment is acknowledge that something is happening, right? And like how that calls us to action, I would love to give a whole hour-long presentation on what that means in terms of action. But just to get into what we're gonna do tonight, I'll share these two pieces. The first one is by a poet named Basman al-Dirawi. This is from an anthology called Light in Gaza, which is all essays and poems and stories from actual Gazans. So not people talking about Palestinians, but actual Palestinians, right, in Gaza. And it's called Don't Step on My Feet Again. Oh, by the way, that anthology is available for free right now as an ebook from Haymarket Books. But it's called Don't Step on My Feet Again. Under the constant buzzing of drones, the roar of F-16s over my head while I play hide and seek with peace, whispering, don't be just a break in between assaults. The electricity goes off, total darkness, while I dance with hope, whispering, don't step on my feet again. At the border crossing between the earth and sky, I will stand for hours. My legs are shaking, the sweat all over my body, a voice inside my head whispering, you're a full human being, even if you feel like half. And the other one I want to share is by Sam Sachs. Who's a poet you may know of already. This is an abecedarian, and that's a specific poetic form where like it's based on the alphabet. So every line starts with like A, and then B, and then C, and then D. This is by Sam Sachs. After you've finished building your missiles and after your borders collapse under the weight of their own split databases, every worm in this fertile and cursed ground will be its own country. Home never was a place in dirt or even inside the skin, but rather just exists in language. Let me explain. My people kiss books as a form of prayer. If dropped, we lift them to our lips and mouth an honest and uncomplicated apology. Nowhere on earth belongs to us. Once, a man welcomed me home as I entered the old city, so I pulled out a book of poems to show him my papers, my queer city of paper, my people's ink running through my blood. Settlers believe land can be possessed. They carve their names into firearms and use this to impersonate the dead. We are visitors here on earth. Who but men blame the angels for the wild exceptionalism of men? Yesterday, a bird flew through an airport, and I watched that border. I watched that border zone collapse under its basic wings. So yeah, Sam Sachs, amazing poet, has a bunch of good stuff out there. But yeah, I just wanted to bring those voices into the space. Another poem I had in my pocket was by Suhair Hamad. You ever heard of Suhair Hamad? People of my generation, like if you grew up watching like Def Poetry Jam, Suhair Hamad was on Def Poetry Jam, and she was really the poet who like made me interested in spoken word. I was an undergrad. I was in my first semester of my first year of undergrad when 9/11 happened. Suhair Hamad was a poet who wrote about the what happened right after 9/11 better than anyone else I can imagine, and like she's incredible. The reason I'm not sharing her poem is because it's very easy to find online, and I'll talk more about that later. But like you can watch her perform it. So obviously there's not space here to say everything that needs to be said. I just wanted to at least bring those voices into the space. The thing that I'm going to talk about tonight, through the course of the poems that I share, is probably the idea of narrative. The importance of like being able to see narratives, the kind of stories that animate how we think about issues and places and ourselves and other people, to be able to see narratives, but then also to recognize the power that we have to shape narratives, that we are not just victims of narratives that have already been written, but that we can write our own too. And so I realized I started very heavy. Are y'all feeling okay? Let me start with a poem of my own that is about narrative, but is specifically about narratives about poetry and how it is a very, stereotyped form and how people have a lot of preconceived notions about it. And this is a poem called Poem for the First Day of the Poetry Unit in Language Arts Class. Not everyone who studies the sky has to become a begoggled balloon pilot. Some just like looking at the clouds because they're pretty. Some are more concerned with weather patterns and their effect on crops. Some are just charting a course from point A to point B, a matter of routine, which is all to say, it is okay if you don't like poetry. I don't really like the sky. The sun gives me a migraine. The wind blows in my face. It snows on days I don't want it to snow. You will never find me in the gondola of a hot air balloon 1,000 paces from where I should be pacing. But language has made me weightless. If only for a moment, a poem once or twice has guided me home. So I want to say something like, when your teacher makes you write a poem for class, don't think of it as an assignment. Think of it as an opportunity. But that's kind of corny. A lot of things that are true are kind of corny. This isn't a very good poem. I wrote it like yesterday. It wouldn't get published in like the New Yorker. And yeah, it'd be better if it were better, but sometimes you see a stage and it's the sky waiting for you to scream something alive into it. So tell your story, whether it rhymes or not. Tell the truth, whether it gets a good grade or not. Write something that means something to you. Even if you don't publish it or perform it or share it with anyone, poetry is not just about how elegantly we can put some words next to some other words. It's like, think of all the materials with which you could quilt a giant hot air balloon into being. The flags of 100 nations, the banners of 100 warriors, the baby blankets of 100 lost children. But no matter how beautiful or colorful or well constructed the balloon itself is, none of that makes it fly. And yeah, in this class, we will study how balloons work. We will read old maps, but your job is not to look up and imagine. It is to look down and laugh. Your job is not just to understand flight. It is to fly because you, I would imagine, are more than the container currently holding you. More than the scraps from which you have been sewn together. And the poem you will write does not have to be the first step on some illustrious career as a professional writer. The poem does not have to save anyone. The poem doesn't even have to be good. Let it be honest, and let that be enough. Let it say, this is who I am, and this is the community that I represent, and let that fill as much space as it can, rise off the ground and meet the sky. The first poem I ever wrote was about the end of the world, and I'm old enough now to have lived through the end of a few. And I don't remember the words, just a landscape for the dark cloud in me to rain on. Just the feeling of rising through that cloud. And for the first time, seeing the stars on the other side of it. I don't remember the words, but I remember the light. And I've been walking in its direction ever since. So I think, thank you. I'm really interested in how poetry, how writing can be useful. I'm less interested in being timeless or immortal or beautiful or entertaining or like beloved or becoming rich and famous, but like how can we create work that is useful in some sense? And so on some level, like that poem is super, super literal. I do residency work in high schools, right? And like the first thing people ask in the poetry unit is like, why are we studying poetry? So it's a poem that directly addresses that, talking about how, it isn't just about poetry. It's an opportunity for us to dig deep into ourselves and like figure out who we are and what we believe in, and like that's always valuable. But I think it's not just for those spaces too, right? There's something in it about the power of telling our own stories and how few spaces there are to do that sometimes. Which is the importance of like crafting our not just our own stories, but our kind of collective narratives together. And so again, the idea is that the poem is a doorway into that conversation. I want to share one quick thing before I get into the rest of the poems, which is just, again, we don't have time for a big spoken word 101, but the thing I like to share with people are kind of, for me, the three pillars of spoken word as a form. One of them is the idea that everyone has a story and every story matters, no matter who you are and where you come from, how boring you think your own life is, right? Like everyone's story matters and has something to contribute. That's like just a fundamental pillar. A second one for me is freedom, in that with spoken word, there really aren't any rules. You can write about whatever you want to write about in whatever way you want to write about it, which is very intimidating, right? Especially for people who maybe come from a poetry background, where like a sonnet has a very specific set of rules, right? A sestina, a haiku, a villanelle. And suddenly with spoken word, it's like there are no rules at all. And I think, again, that can be intimidating. It can also be extremely liberating when you can tell your story in your own authentic voice, whatever that is. And then the third pillar for me is something around like community and collectivity. That spoken word as a form is, at least in the modern era, like in my own experience with it, is built around things like open mic nights and poetry slams, where anyone can show up to a poetry slam. Anyone can sign up to share something. Anyone can be a judge and like at a poetry slam. You don't have to be an expert. And actually that's what poetry slams are. It's 5 random people get to be the judges for the night. And that's part of the fun of it, and the terror of it. But like, the idea that, again, everyone has a story, we tell those stories using our own authentic voices, and then we do it together. That it isn't about the brilliance of the person on stage, it's about the collective story that's being told with everybody, and how we all would not be in the room together were it not for these stories. And I think that there's something really, really beautiful about that, and really powerful, and really, important in this historical moment. If you are interested in more spoken word stuff, one of the zines I'm going to talk about, and again, if you don't know the word zine, it's like a little magazine. It's like a little booklet, and it's free. But one of the zines I have has a bunch more information on spoken word, including links to my like 10 favorite poems by other people, including the Suhair Hamad piece I mentioned. I was going to, I know I talk a lot, but that's just because I'm used to being in classrooms where I don't just show up and read poems, but we have conversations and stuff. Should I keep going? Do you have any questions so far? Should I jump? Yeah. I know we're going to do a Q&A, but my instinct is always to pause and be like, how are you feeling? Does anyone have anything they want to say? Cool. What am I doing? All right, I was going to share a couple more pieces from my book, which I know some of you are familiar with, some of you might not be. The very, very brief elevator pitch for the book is called Not a Lot of Reasons to Sing, But Enough, which is a good title. I have to brag about that. Because, it's like what I was saying before, like, it's okay to be cynical, it's okay to be pessimistic. Like, we don't have to be super happy people to be able to do the work, to show up. right? So not a lot of reasons to sing, but enough. And I think of it as a concept album, which is, a musical term, but for a poetry book. And that, it's a bunch of poems, but the poems are within a narrative framing of like, there's this poet who happens to be a robot. It doesn't really matter, but they're a robot, and they have a human apprentice who's like a younger poet, and they travel from village to village to village across this moon. It's a prison colony moon. So it doesn't take place on our planet. And then the poems are like the poems that they hear in these villages, but also the poems that they share in these villages, like around big community bonfires. And you never know, like the poems, there's no credit. And so like any poem that's in the book could be them, it could be other people. Like it's this idea of the multitude of voices coming together to share something. And I wanted to share a piece that I don't often get to perform because it's a little weird. And but if we're talking about narrative, this is one of the pieces in the book that really kind of hits that on the head. It's called, I'll just read it. It's in 3 parts. Part 1. I should mention, just framing-wise, that, like I said, the book it's science fiction, but it's kind of on a pre-industrial world. So, like, there are robots and stuff, but then people, like, have swords. Like, it's that kind of setting. So it's science fiction, but it's also not super, like, futuristic. So part 1. Not for all, but for many, some signal remains. After the body is gone, or gone enough, the signal buzzes and burns and flies in every direction at once. Wireless, it might scream or laugh or soar in silent contemplation. I don't know if it's the same for humans, but for us, even when our bodies are broken, our individual personalities extinguished, our memories erased or just forgotten, this other piece can be. Sometimes it disappears, sometimes it doesn't. In one village, we came upon a necromancer. In a crumbling stone tower, he used wood and wire, bamboo and iron to craft bodies for this essence. Someone somewhere had taught him a music. He built and played this music, built and kept playing, and eventually, like moons gathering in orbit around a world, signals began to dance around his tower. Whether they were bored or lonely or just curious, some danced right into the little bodies he had built. And the bodies would then dance. Free to come and go as they pleased, the signals would dance, disappear, reappear, dance again. This was many years ago. A momentary intermissioning halfway through a much larger story. We camped for a night outside the tower. Our captain dined with the necromancer. We only heard his music, and it felt like home. 2. Is it okay if I curse? Just a little bit. All right. 2. When people ask, why does poetry matter? There are 1,000 answers, and most of them are bullshit. Here is one that is not. Poetry is translation. You take an emotion, an idea, a concept, and you turn it into an image, a memory, a story. You take a signal, and you build it a body. This is obvious. You already know that a message is generally more effective when it is wrapped up in a story, but there is a deeper truth here. It isn't just the specific metaphor that matters. It is the mechanics of metaphor itself. Being able to see something through some other thing. Understanding the connection, the conversation between what is large and what is small. What is far away and what is close. What is you and what is not you. Too many do not. In another village, we meet a man who denies abusing his wife for decades because he never struck her. He could not understand violence beyond physical harm. In another village, the town guards kill a child who had stolen an apple and run. When confronted about the disproportionate response to the crime, their response is that the child should not have run. They could not understand morality beyond obedience. In another village, we find a community decimated by a highly contagious sickness. The people loved each other so much and they could not understand connection beyond proximity. In another village, Every leadership position is held by men. All of the wealth is controlled by men. All decisions are made by men. For over 2 generations, all other genders are treated as less than, as objects and never subjects. When a rowdy group of young people of varying gender identities finally confront the village's ruling council about this state of affairs, the men respond, "We men have shouldered this burden for generations. We have provided for you. We have loved you, and this is how you repay us." The men cannot understand oppression beyond hatred. In another village, the boss has taken to scapegoating the community's newest members. Recent arrivals from a nearby village experiencing a drought. He blames them for the poverty of the people, the failure of the crops, the poor weather, as if they somehow carried the drought with them. When a villager then murders 2 of these new arrivals, the boss states, "No one could have predicted this terrible tragedy. He could not understand responsibility beyond culpability." A plague of literalism, a plague of concepts poorly translated. Would more poetry solve these problems? No. Many who perpetrate harm know that they are doing so. Many willfully mistranslate ideas in order to protect their own power, their own comfort. But the proper translations still matter. A story can only be challenged by another story or a swirling murmuration of stories. I don't know if poetry matters, but this thing underneath poetry, this impulse to dig deeper, to make connections, to see beyond this matters. In part 3, we passed the tower again as we returned homeward from our story. The necromancer was gone. All of his bootleg bodies crumbled. It is possible he simply lost interest, moved on. It is possible the signals themselves lost interest and moved on. But as soldiers, we recognize the subtle topography of battle, even a quiet battle. Someone had decided that what the necromancer was doing was unnatural. Someone could not understand natural beyond familiar. No bodies, no blood, no obvious signs of struggle, but the hole where the music would have been. The signalless silence. A sad story, but sadness is energy also. Build a body for it. Watch it dance. I will try to land on something that's a little more like uplifting. But I'll do a few more pieces, then we'll do some Q&A. There's so many poems I have in my head and so many in the book, and I'm still thinking about this question of narrative. And again, I want to get to the poem that I'm really excited about, but in order to get there, I want to share a poem that makes me sad. It's not a sad poem in a direct emotional sense, but it's a poem about tension. I think one of the values of spoken word as a practice, because it's based in community, in showing up to events and performing and sharing it with people and getting feedback, is it's a space to stand up in front of a bunch of people and talk, even if you don't know the answer to the question you're asking. And like that seems really, really simple, right? That an artist doesn't have to have all the answers. But if we think about the society we're in, if we think about like if any of y'all are college students or at a college, like the pressure sometimes to just like have the answer, to know the answer to the question, the pressure on social media to always be the loudest, rightest voice. And like art can be a space where we don't have all the answers and we can still talk about the thing. We can still grapple with the tension. Tension can be such a powerful source for art. And so I want to share this partly because of all the stuff I just said, and then partly because I think it reflects what's happening right now in a lot of people's heads, including my own. Upon stumbling by chance upon a man waist deep in quicksand, I need a moment to process because that's kind of weird, right? Like quicksand, it's like a cartoon. It's like going to the zoo and seeing a mermaid. So my first response, naturally, is to say to him, hey, I'm pretty sure I read on the internet somewhere that quicksand isn't real. That this idea of a patch of sandy water that sucks a person down into oblivion is just a tall tale, right? In real life, yeah, maybe you could get stuck in some mud or whatever, but it's not really that hard to get out. Are you sure you're sinking in quicksand? He sinks. My words don't seem to have any impact at all. So, being an open-minded, progressive individual, I reevaluate. Maybe quicksand is real, so what now? Well, my second response upon stumbling by chance upon a man chest deep in quicksand is, before I actually do anything, just to make sure I have the whole picture, because, what was this guy doing out here in the jungle all alone? Did he step into that quicksand on purpose? Was he asking for it? Does he have a criminal record? Maybe I should wait until all the facts come in. He sinks. And being an open-minded, progressive individual, I decide to give him the benefit of the doubt. At least for now, I want to help. So my third response upon stumbling by chance upon a man neck deep in quicksand is, obviously, to recite a poem, to throw some positive energy his way, to describe out loud just how heavy my heart is. I take a piece of paper out of my backpack, and with the pen, I write, quicksand is bad, and I am an ally to those who fall in it. I pin that piece of paper to my chest. I take out my phone, and I post, when are we going to wake up? Hashtag quicksand. He sinks. And being an open-minded, progressive individual, I decide that this isn't enough. Right? That we as a society need to address the root causes of people sinking into quicksand. So my fourth response upon stumbling by chance upon a man forehead deep in quicksand is to take a moment to acknowledge my privilege. As someone who is not sinking into quicksand, I vow to, take a class or be more mindful of how I navigate the world. He sinks, and being an open-minded, progressive individual, I decide that the time for words has passed. Now is the time for action. So my fifth response, upon stumbling by chance upon a man disappeared into we can't allow ourselves to forget what happened here. I know that we need to do something, right? To put up a sign, to educate people, to build a bridge over this patch of quicksand. I just don't have any wood. I just have this backpack full of paper and pens and rope. And what can one person even do? I imagine my lungs filling with mud. Black earth, brown water. The hike back to my hotel will be full of reflection. I offer my thoughts and my prayers. It is the least I can do. Looking at the time, I mentioned I'm not a motivational speaker, right? But I found that piece to be useful in a lot of the facilitation spaces and education spaces that I'm in. Again, not as the thing that tells you what to think or what to do, but as the story that opens up a conversation about when we are feeling overwhelmed by injustice that does not affect us personally, what do we do? And I think the tension in the poem is that a lot of the stuff that I talk about is good, right? We should be posting on the internet about stuff that matters. We should be creating art about it. We should be thinking critically about privilege, and we should be doing all these things. And I think the tension in the poem comes from those can be good things and we should do them, and they're individual answers to a collective problem. And our individual responses are never gonna be enough. It doesn't mean they're not worth doing. They can be first steps into other kinds of work, but then the question becomes, what is a collective solution to a collective problem? And I know we're approaching the end, but I asked that question not because it's some like brilliant, poetic, rhetorical question. I think there is actually an answer to it. I think the answer is organizing, right? Like joining organizations, collectives, unions, student groups, like these types of formations where if the question is like, what can one person do about the climate crisis or the war in Gaza or economic inequality or all these different issues, the answer is that one person can't do anything. But what one person can do is join a group, join a collective effort. And throughout history, collective efforts and organizations have changed things. And that work is still happening right now. And so if you are interested in that, I think I'll just do like one more and then the Q&A. But I will just very briefly explain these zines that were mentioned. So everything that I was just talking about like joining organizations and like becoming an organizer, I know when I was 18, like I didn't know what any of that stuff meant. Like what does that actually look like? And so I put together this zine called Of What Future Are These the Wild Early Days, which is all about like readings and frameworks and food for thought and resources about what it means to show up as an activist, what it means to get into that work for the first time if you've never done it before. I might run out of these, but this is also, all these are available online in full. And the online version is even better because you can click on the links, right? But that's there. Along the same lines, this other zine very specifically is about, it's called How Do We Build a Culture of Consent? And that question was very intentional in that it's not just how do we practice consent as individuals, that's a lot of what the conversation is, but how do we collectively build a culture of consent? And I asked that question to people all around the country and kind of synthesized their answers into this zine. As long as I'm talking about these, I'll just have a couple more. The jellyfish one is if you are interested in spoken word. So if you want some resources on like getting involved in spoken word, finding more ways to watch good examples of spoken word, some tips for like even your own writing process. Like this is the thing I wish someone would have handed me when I was 17, right? And so I tried to put everything I could in here, including examples of my favorite spoken word poems by other people. The one that was mentioned before, there's Hope. This is a collection of quotes about hope. Hope, again, not just as like a fluffy, happy feeling in our hearts, but as a thing that is sometimes harder to find. Like, how do we actually cultivate that? How do we build it into our practices? Yeah. I have a lot of zines. I love these because the zine practice, it's like, talk about something that you're passionate about, that's exciting for you, whether it's like a band that you like or a hobby that you have, and just like put it all into this little booklet and give them to all your friends, right? The Art of Taking the L is a poem I wrote about masculinity. It has a bunch of other examples, not examples, but articles and resources and videos and stuff about like critical masculinity, like how do we embody a healthy version of masculinity? I have two more, oh my goodness. This is called Abolition, right? We talk about how like that question of like, what do we do in a world without prisons? Like that can be scary. Like people have legit questions about it. And so this is a zine I did in collaboration with some people on like frequently asked questions about abolition and just some like basic kind of answers and then pointing them towards other resources. Because it's a big question and like it's okay to have questions. And then the last one, and then I'll do a last poem. It's called BTS 40K. It is a contrapuntal poem where you write one poem and then you write a second poem and then it can be read across as a third poem. Difficult form to write, but it was a lot of fun. It's about the K-pop group BTS, and then if any of y'all know Warhammer 40K, it's like a dystopian like science fiction setting, and I've juxtaposed them. Like, what's the most hopeful thing and the most dystopian thing I could write about, and how can I just smash them together? And the last page also has my BTS song recommendations. If you're not familiar, those are the songs I would start with. All right. I think I'll do one more and then we'll Q&A. Is that okay? I'm just asking. I have a million poems. You can watch them on the internet. This one is newer though, and so I figured maybe people haven't heard it. Not that any of you have heard any of my stuff, but again, that's my thought process. This is also a poem that happens to be most exciting for me to perform because it brings together a lot of the work that I do. It's a poem about narrative and like stories, everything we've been talking about around the importance of shaping narratives and telling better, more accurate stories about people and places and policies and things. It's also a poem about masculinity. A lot of my work is about masculinity. And it's a weird science fiction, alternate universe, multiverse, post-apocalyptic poem. All those things smashed together. It starts with a quote from an archaeologist named Chris Begley, who wrote a book called The Next apocalypse. He's an archaeologist who studies collapse. And so when societies throughout history have collapsed, who survives, right? And we have a narrative in our head about who that is, and then there's the actual historical record, and those do not match up. So the quote is, "We are preparing for the wrong disaster." And the poem is called, "When It Really Is Just the Wind and Not a Furious Vexation." The year I was born, the Soviet Union's early warning radar system malfunctioned, reporting 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles in flight, a preemptive nuclear strike. You may have heard the story how a single lieutenant colonel made the call to dismiss the signal as the false alarm that it was. But I mean, that was close, right? Like, what if he had made a different call in that moment? What if he had seen those 5 ghost fingers as a fist, a mushroom cloud? The most dangerous cliche, I hold it in my hands on my 40th birthday and it becomes a bouquet, 1,000 stems leading to 1,000 worlds in which cooler heads did not prevail, to 1,000 alternate universe versions of me born in the year of the apocalypse. I see myself dead via radiation poisoning, dead via the shutdown of the supply system or the failure of the water system, or like the reemergence of previously preventable diseases, dead in such manly ways, right? Like an unlucky fall in a fist fight over nothing, like a scratch that got ignored and infected. I pluck petals, trying to find a version of me who survives, hoping to find that, you know, leather jacket, black motorcycle, katana strapped to my back version, that warrior poet, lone vessel of vengeance, keeping the wasteland's unending tide of razor-clawed mutants at bay version, all these dead worlds. And he isn't out there. All these visions of who I could have been, and not a single hero, folk, super, anti, or otherwise. In one life, I wore a suit of armor and drowned in the river. In one life, I hoarded food and choked on it. In one life, the basement was so full of boxes of bullets, a tornado came and I had nowhere to go, no shelter. I emptied clip after clip into the wind. All these dead worlds, and we tell the same stories. Which is not to say that I never survive, just that my survival in every reality where it is possible never belongs to me. I see myself 40, not a dual-wielding bandit warlord, but just a neighbor, sitting in some endless community meeting because how many of our ancestors have already taught us, even after the world ends, there is work to do? I see myself in the work, not the leader, not a lone wolf, just another part of the pack, because in every universe in which I am alive, it is because of other people, and I don't always like them, but I love them. In every universe in which I am alive, it is less because I could fight and more because I could forgive, because I could cooperate, because I could apologize, because I could dance, because I could grow pumpkins in my backyard and leave them on my neighbor's doorstep asking for nothing in return. In every universe in which I am alive, I'm holding a first aid kit, a solar panel, a sleeping cat, never a rusty battle axe or a rocket launcher. Yeah, maybe sometimes a chainsaw, but only for firewood. I'm holding a cooking pot, a photo album, a teddy bear, a basketball, a bouquet of flowers. Survival is not a fortress. It is a garden. Survival is not a siren. It is a symphony. And yes, we fight for it sometimes, of course. But survival is not the fight. It is the healing after. Clean water washing away the blood. The soft hum of someone you trust just sitting with you. The feeling of falling asleep in a safe place. So just to land that, like, if the pop culture narrative about survival is like the people who survive collapse and crisis are the strongest, the toughest, the ones who don't trust anybody, reality does not reflect that. Historically, people who survive are the ones who can work together. People who survive are the ones who can put their egos aside and actually cooperate and, all that kind of stuff. And I feel like that is interesting on its own, but it also is such a good metaphor for masculinity and how we think about what it means to like be a man, what it means to be in control and powerful, and how all those qualities end up, in the book, it talks about how they end up being weight, not weapons. And yeah, I could keep talking for a long time. But any thoughts, questions before we wrap up this evening? Oh, there are microphones if you don't want to shout at me. You're right in the middle.
Okay, hi there. I was wondering if you had any specific rituals or routines that you did in order to get the best creative process that you can. But we also kind of talked about that earlier, and you were just like, screw it, like sit down and write kind of thing. So I was curious if you had anything specific, though, that was like very nurturing to your process.
So now you're asking for me to give a better answer than what I said before. Yeah. Ritual is an interesting word because I think about ritual a lot as a performer. Like, I don't know if you can tell, but like, I don't like being up in front of people. It's my job and I do it every day, but I'm very introverted. And so ritual to me is like, I always wear the same stupid hat. And like, I have 2 hats that I wear. If you watch my videos online, every video I'm wearing one of the 2 hats. And like, stuff like that. And my rings, jewelry. I'm a jewelry person. But I think in terms of writing, if any of you are writers and are looking for me, maybe the word ritual isn't as applicable here. Because like for some people, yeah, it's like you sit in the same spot at the same time of day. And like that can be totally good for you. It's not really my process. But I think rather than ritual, I think a word that I would use is kind of like a tool. And I talked to some of you today. Some of you maybe heard me talk about this. But my favorite writing tool is the very, very short version is taking something big and making it small. Right, so like taking the thing that you want to write about, whether that is the prison industrial complex or grief about losing someone who's close to you, or the complexity of a family who has tension around blah, blah, blah. Like whatever that issue is, how do you zoom in on it and make it small? And because then you write about the small thing rather than the big thing. The small thing becomes the entry point into the big thing. And like if you go through all my poems, you can probably find examples of that, right? So like, the first poem that I read was about poetry and about self-expression and about creativity, but I don't just stand up and say like, hey everyone, poetry and self-expression and creativity are cool. Like, it's all through the lens of the hot air balloon, right? The hot air balloon, I mean, this is a metaphor, right? Like using the hot air balloon as an image that opens the door to the other stuff that we want to talk about. And like, that's really, really basic. I know this is a simple thing. It's very like poetry 101 stuff, like using images to talk about ideas. But I think there's something deeper there when we're talking about political issues or like social justice issues or like climate, like all these really big world issues that for so many people are abstract. And so that question of how do we make them come to life? How do we make them real? How do we communicate in a way that actually hits people? That shouldn't be the word that I use. That actually like connects to people. I think that impulse to take the big thing and make it small is a really, really useful impulse. Even if you don't think of yourself as a writer or a poet, it's like a critical thinking exercise. Yeah, I could blah, blah, blah about that forever. Is that helpful at all?
Is there a specific poet or genre of poetry that made you kind of realize like, yeah, I want to do this?
I love that question because then I can brag about people who aren't me, or I can, hype up people. And really, this might be a little cliche, but it really was spoken word that made me interested in poetry. It wasn't like in high school reading Dylan Thomas, like whoever, right? Like it was spoken word. To see people who were maybe just a little bit older than me, from many different walks of life, like performing, like that changed my life. And so for me, when I was 17, 18, 19, that would have been like Suhair Hamad, who I mentioned, and yeah, incredible. Probably Saul Williams. Y'all know Saul Williams? One of the biggest poets in spoken word history. So Suhair Hamad, Saul Williams. I would also shout out, like, Maida Levaye was here a couple years ago, right? Or like pretty recently. I could go on and on and on. But I think, that's probably a good start. Those two really were the gateway for me. And then, discovering so many more. And the thing about spoken word, I really want to emphasize this, is that there aren't a lot of stars. There are a couple, like, if you know, like Andrea Gibson and like Saul Williams and Rudy Francisco, there are a couple stars, but it is so much more driven by communities, right? Like, even if you never go viral on the internet or you never build a career out of it, spoken word as a cultural kind of movement is, again, based on once a month we all get together at this bar and we read poems together. It's stuff like that. And like that's, like, if those people brought me into the work, like that kind of community element is what kept me in the work. So yeah. Oh, I want to mention Patricia Smith too, probably my favorite poet, if y'all know Patricia Smith. But yeah. Any others? I will also, this might be the last question in terms of the time that we have, but like, I'm not going anywhere. I will stick around. If people have any other questions, I would love to keep talking.
You have a very powerful voice, both when you're reading a poem and when you're just speaking. How did you develop it? Or were there any little techniques that helped?
Oh, these are not plants. Like, that's a really good question, and I'm so glad you asked it, because a thing that I love to emphasize to people is that if you are at all interested in spoken word or slam poetry or like performance, that you don't have to be a natural, like, outgoing, energetic person to do it. Because, like, again, like I mentioned, I'm a very, very introverted person. I'm super quiet and shy, and I mumble when I talk, and like, this is not my normal speaking voice. Like, I always have to over-project a little bit, and I think that's the key, right? And so you ask, like, how did I become someone who talks in front of audiences for a living? And the magical mystery tactic is just practice. Well, I'll say two things. One is repetition, practice, right? Like, a lot of the stuff around how we channel emotion, how we project our voice, how we enunciate, how we breathe, that's stuff that we can learn. You don't have to be born knowing how to do that. It's practice. But then, like, how do we learn that? How do we practice? In community. It's really, really hard to just do it in front of a mirror or like to film yourself and put it on YouTube. It's like, but to have a writing circle, to have an open mic or a poetry slam you can go to regularly, to even just have a couple friends who like co-edit a Google document together, like to find some kind of community. And I know you asked specifically about performance, but I think this relates to writing too. To not, again, narrative, right? The narrative about poetry is that it's intensely individual. And in my experience, people who are really successful, people who I love and respect who do this work, it is not intensely individual. It is a community thing. We get together, we give each other feedback, we make fun of each other. We like, whether it's in person or just through the internet, a very intensely collaborative, collective process. And I think that is especially true for performance. To have a group of people who will tell you like, you need to be a little bit louder here, or like enunciate a little bit better at this point, like those little things. So much of this is mechanical. Like, there is kind of a spiritual element to performance, but there is also a very, very down-to-earth mechanical element of how we use our voices and our bodies. So yeah. I want to coach. Oh yeah, so yeah, please, thank you. Like I said, there's a million more things we could talk about, but I'm not going anywhere, so I'll be over there. I have a bunch of these free zines, but let's, please come up, please.